The first thing they teach you about a sniper range is that it is the quietest, violent place on Earth. I had been on loud ranges before. Pistol pits where the noise came off the walls like a slap, machine gun lines where the air itself seemed to tear. This was not that. On the morning I drove out to Cape Varick, the long glass range was so still I could hear the cold water working at the rocks a mile below, and the only man-made sound for a long time was the wind pushing at the marram grass and the tick of my rental cooling in the gravel lot. I had come to write about the course. That was the arrangement, negotiated over 4 months in 3 offices, and embed, authorized, chaperoned, to profile the Naval Special Warfare Sniper Cell that trained on this stretch of gray northern coast. I had a lanyard, a notebook, and a standing instruction not to name the students. What I did not have that first morning was any sense that I was about to spend 2 weeks learning that I did not understand the thing I had flown out to describe. The range ran along the top of a headland. To the north the land fell away into Varick Sound, a cold cut of water maybe 2,000 meters wide at the throat, with a fishing town smeared along the far shore under a low sky. The firing line faced west into open country, and at the long positions, out over the water itself, where targets sat on floating steel racks that rose and dipped with the swell. Everything about the place was built to punish anyone who thought they already knew how to shoot. The wind here did not come from one direction. It came off the sea and bent around the headland and doubled back through the draws, so that a bullet fired from the line might cross 3 different winds on its way out. Men who could hold a palm-sized group at 1,000 meters on a desert flat came here and watched their rounds walk off into the grass and could not explain why. Master Chief Wade Cannon explained why, at length, on my first morning, standing at the head of the line with his hands behind his back like a man addressing a court. "The desert lies to you," he said. He was 50 maybe, with a face weathered to the color and texture of a saddle, and pale eyes that had clearly spent 30 years looking at things very far away. "The desert gives you one wind, and it lets you feel like a marksman. Then it sends you here to find out you were guessing." He looked down the line of candidates, 12 of them, all men, all hard, all quiet in the particular way of people who have already survived selection courses that broke better men. The long glass does not care what you did before. It only cares whether you can read what is in front of you, right now, in this second, and put a round through it before the second is gone. I wrote that down. It was good copy. I did not yet know how completely I would come to believe it. I spent that first hour learning the geography of the line, the near positions at 300, the mid positions out to 1,000, and the long positions past that, the ones that reached out over the water toward the racks in the Sound. I learned the ritual of it, the way each shooter worked with a spotter, the low murmured language of holds and corrections. I learned that Cannon ran the cadre like a man who had personally buried the cost of every mistake a sniper could make, because he had. And I learned the students' names, which I am still not allowed to print, so I will call them what I called them in my own head that week. The boxer, the farm kid, the quiet Texan, and so on down the line, 12 men. And one person I did not count at all, because I assumed she was staff. She had come out with the water truck. That is the honest shape of my first mistake, and I am setting it down plainly because the whole of what follows only means anything if I am honest about where I started. There was a woman on the range that morning, standing back by the equipment, and I looked straight at her and filed her under support. She was not big. She had a stillness to her that I read at the time as the stillness of someone whose job is to wait at the edge of other people's work. Her hair was pulled back hard. Her kit was worn to the point of anonymity. No unit flash I could read, no rack of anything, just a faded top and trousers, and a pair of boots that had clearly walked a great deal of ground. She carried a rifle case, a long one, and I assumed she was carrying it for one of the men. I want to be clear that I was not alone in this. Every man on that line had looked at her the same way. You could see it in how they arranged themselves, the small unconscious geometry of people who have decided, without a word, that someone does not count. They left a space around her the way you leave a space around furniture. Cannon looked at her, the way you look at a problem you intend to solve later. Her name, I will use the one part of it I am permitted, was Ray's. I learned it because she was the only person on the range that morning who spoke to me without being told to. I had drifted back toward the equipment to get out of the wind, and she was there, unhurried, laying out gear on a mat with the economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She glanced at my lanyard, then at my hands and said, "First time on a real coast range." That obvious. You keep bracing against the wind like it's going to stop. She didn't look up. It won't. Best thing you can do is quit fighting it and start reading it. Watch the grass, not the flags, the grass. Flags lie to you up here. Grass tells the truth. I wrote it down. Watch the grass, not the flags. I thought it was a nice line from a member of the support staff. I did not think anything else about it, because just then the boxer came back off the line, sweating and swearing under his breath, having watched 3 good rounds vanish into the draw, and Cannon called the next shooter forward, and I forgot the woman entirely for the better part of an hour. When I remembered her, it was because Cannon had stopped talking. He had been walking the line, correcting, barking, and he came level with the equipment and saw her crouched by a candidate's rifle, the farm kid's, with the bolt out, looking down the bore, doing something to the way the bipod was set. The farm kid was watching her with the expression of a man being shown something, and Cannon's face changed. Not to anger, not yet. To something colder. The face of a man whose range had just been touched by a hand he had not authorized. "Off the line," he said. She didn't argue. She set the bolt back, stood, stepped away. I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning of the thing the whole rest of this account is about, and I saw all of it, and I did nothing, because I too had decided she did not count. It happened the next morning, and it happened fast, the way the worst things on a range happen fast. There had been a bad night. I heard about it later, a signals problem, a piece of the course schedule collapsing, one of the cadre pulled away, Cannon short of body and short of sleep and running the whole line himself. When I got to the range at first light, he was already wound tight, and the wind was up, and the men were missing, and every miss landed on him personally because that is how he carried it. Ray's was at the long positions. She had gone out to the far end of the line, past the 1,000-meter mark, out where the positions reached over the water toward the racks in the Sound. She was prone. She had a rifle up her own, I realized later, the long case she'd carried in, and she was doing nothing dramatic at all. She was lying still behind it, cheek down, reading the water, in exactly the posture I had by then watched 12 trained men fail to hold. She had not fired. She was not, as far as I could tell, going to fire. She was reading. But she was on the line. And she was on the long positions, the ones Cannon reserved for the students who had earned them, and she had not asked, and Cannon saw her, and something in him that had been stretched all night simply let go. He crossed the range faster than I had seen him move. The men went quiet. He reached the long position, and he did not say off the line this time. He reached down and took her by the back of the collar and the arm, and he hauled her up off the mat, physically, one hard motion, the way you'd clear a drunk out of a doorway. Her rifle went down onto the mat. Her cheek came up off the stock. And he marched her, walked her, gripping her arm off the firing line, off the mat, back onto the gravel, in front of the entire course, in front of the cadre, in front of me and my notebook and my lanyard. "This is not a place for you," he said. His voice was not loud. That was the worst of it. It was flat and certain, and it carried the whole length of that silent range. "This line is for shooters. You want to make yourself useful. You fill the water cans and you stay behind the equipment where I put you. You do not touch a candidate's weapon. You do not lie down on my long positions like you belong there. Am I understood?" I was close enough to see her face. She did not flinch. That is the detail I keep returning to, the one I could not make sense of at the time and can make perfect sense of now. A man twice her size had just hauled her off the ground by the collar and dressed her down in front of 40 years of the community's hardest men, and her face did not do any of the things a face does. It did not flush. It did not crumple. Her jaw did not set in anger. She simply looked at him, level, still, patient, the way you look at weather, and she said quietly, "Understood, Master Chief." And she went and stood behind the equipment. The men looked away. That is its own kind of verdict, the way a room full of people find somewhere else to put their eyes. The boxer studied his boots. The quiet Texan looked out at the water. Cannon turned back to the line as though he had swatted a fly and called the next shooter forward, and the morning ground on. I stood there with my pen not moving, and I felt the small, sick discomfort of a man watching something unfair happen to someone who does not count enough for him to say anything. I told myself it was his range. I told myself I did not know the rules. I told myself she was, after all, support, and had after all put herself on the long positions without leave, and that this was simply the friction of a hard place. I believed all of that for about 6 more days. Here is what I did not understand yet, and what the rest of that first week slowly forced into me. Everything about the way she stood behind that equipment was wrong for the story I had written in my head. Support staff fidget. They check phones, they drift, they watch the shooting the way you watch a sport, with interest but no stake. Reyes did none of that. She stood behind the equipment with her hands quiet, and she watched the range the way Cannon watched it, reading it, the whole width of it, the wind in the grass and the swell on the water and the light. When a candidate missed, her eyes went to the target and then to the draw where the round had gone, tracking the miss to its cause, before the candidate himself had even understood he'd missed. She did it without expression. She did it the way you breathe. I started watching her instead of the shooters. It made for a strange few days. A shooter would take his position out at 900 meters, and the spotter would call the wind, and I would look at Reyes, standing 40 feet back with no scope and no dope card and no stake in the outcome, and I would see her lips move very slightly, and then the shot would go, and the round would land exactly where her lips had said it would and nowhere near where the spotter had called. She was reading the range better standing flat-footed behind the water cans, by eye, than trained spotters were reading it through 40-power glass. On the 4th day I could not stand it anymore, and I went and stood next to her. Cannon had put a candidate, the boxer, on a hard position, an 1100-meter shot out over the water at a rack that was rising and falling with the swell. The boxer was good. He had been good all week. He settled, and his spotter called a wind, and I heard Reyes beside me say almost soundlessly, "He's going to miss left. He's holding for the flag wind. The real wind's under it, coming off the water the other way." The boxer fired. The round went left, wide left, into the swell, throwing up a small cold plume a body length off the rack. The boxer swore. The spotter frowned at his instruments, and I turned and looked at the woman Master Chief Wade Cannon had hauled off his range by the collar, and for the first time I felt the ground of the whole story shift under me. The specific vertigo of realizing that the person everyone in the room has decided does not count is the only person in the room who actually knows what she is looking at. "How did you?" I started. "Watch the grass," she said, "not the flags." And she almost smiled and did not, and went back to reading the water. I went back to my notes that night in the little motel on the town side of the Sound, and I sat for a long time without writing anything, because I did not have a frame for what I was seeing. I had come to write about 12 hard men learning to read a hard range. I was watching a woman nobody had let onto the line read it better than all of them combined, from behind the water cans, in silence, having said, "Understood, Master Chief," to the man who threw her off it. And I did not yet know who she was. I only knew, by the end of that week, that I had been wrong about her in a way that was starting to feel less like a small mistake and more like the whole point. The thing that made me right, that made all of us right, that made Cannon stand up straight and go pale and lift his hand to his brow, did not come from the range at all. It came from across the water, from the far shore, from the smear of fishing town under the low gray sky, on the ninth morning, when the thing that no course can drill for actually happened. But I am getting ahead of it. I want to set down the ninth morning properly, because it is the reason I am writing any of this. And to set it down properly, I have to first tell you about the man on the far shore, and the way the whole line reached for him and missed. That's beats 1/6, about 2,500 words of finished story this turn honest count. I'd rather flag it straight than pad. The next turn covers B7, B13. The man on the far shore, the whole line missing, Cannon forced to hand her the rifle, the slackwater setup, the cold bore shot, the sealed slackwater files surfacing, and the salute carrying it to the 12,000 floor. Say continue and I'll pick up right at the man on the far shore. Bye. Then I'll drop both updated tracker rows as pastable text. Once the story hits full length continue. The far shore had a name I never got. The men on the range called it, the town and Cannon called it, across the water, and on my map it was a cluster of unmarked dots, a fishing village of maybe 600 souls strung along a stone quay under the same low sky that sat on the range. 2,000 meters of cold sound lay between it and the headland. On a clear morning you could see the boats working and the smoke coming off the chimneys, and with glass, the individual people moving on the quay. It was close enough to watch and far enough that watching was all you could do. On the ninth morning, we watched something start to go wrong over there before anyone understood what it was. I noticed it because Ray's noticed it. I had by then fallen into the habit of positioning myself where I could see her, and I saw her go still in a new way, not the reading stillness she carried all day, but something sharper, a hunting stillness. She had stopped watching the range. She was watching the town. I followed her eyes and saw, across the water, a knot of activity on the quay, small figures moving fast, and then the particular stutter of movement that even at 2,000 meters reads as panic. A boat pulling wrong, people running from something instead of toward their work. Then the radio in the range hut started talking, and a runner came out at a dead sprint, and the morning came apart. I will give it to you the way it reached us in pieces, because that is how it came. A man on the far quay had taken hostages. Not a drill, not an exercise, a real man, come off a real boat, with a real weapon and some private catastrophe driving him, and he had 3 people backed against the stone at the head of the quay, and he had already put one round into the air and was screaming things across the water that we could not hear. The local response, whatever it was for a town that size, was minutes away and coming by road around the head of the sound, which meant a long time, too long. And the range with its long positions reaching out over the water, the range with the only long guns for 40 miles, was directly across from the quay at a distance that, I heard Cannon say into the radio in a voice gone suddenly flat and fast, was call it 2,000 over water in this wind. 2,000 meters, over cold moving water, in the long glass wind. I did not need to be a shooter to understand what that number meant on that range. I had spent 9 days watching trained men lose rounds into the draw at half that distance. I had watched the boxer miss at 1,100. 2,000 meters across the sound was not a shot. It was a prayer with a rifle attached. But there was a man across the water with a gun to a woman's head, and there was no one else, and no time, and so Cannon did the only thing the situation allowed. He put his best shooter on the long position and told him to try. His best shooter was the quiet Texan, and I want to be fair to him, because what he did in the next 10 minutes was not failure in any ordinary sense. He got behind the long gun. He built his position with hands that did not shake. His spotter got up beside him and started calling the wind and the range and the drop, and the numbers they traded were enormous, holds stacked on holds, and the Texan worked the problem like the professional he was. Cannon crouched behind them both with the radio, relaying what the far shore was doing, his voice clipped down to nothing. The first round went at 09:14. I checked my watch because I did not know what else to do with my hands. It missed. We could not see where a round at that distance simply vanishes, but the man on the key kept moving and the hostages stayed against the wall, so it had missed. The spotter corrected. The Texan fired again. It missed again. A third correction, a third round, and the man across the water dragged one of the hostages sideways, repositioning, which told us we were near enough to frighten him and not near enough to end it, which is the worst place to be. Cannon put a second shooter up alongside the boxer, on the next long position, and now there were two guns working the far shore, two spotters calling, 4 rounds, 6, 8, and I stood there and watched the finest shooters that hard place had produced throw everything they had across 2,000 meters of moving water, and I watched every round of it fail to arrive. The wind was doing to them what it had done all week, only now a person's life was riding on the draw where the rounds were dying. The Texan's jaw was iron. The boxer was breathing wrong. Cannon crouched between them with the radio pressed to his head and his pale eyes fixed on the far key and his knuckles white, and for the first time in 9 days I saw the certainty go out of him. And 40 feet back, behind the equipment where he had put her, Ray's was already moving. She did not run, that is the thing I keep. She walked fast, economical, no wasted motion, to her own long case, the one she had carried in on the first morning, and she went down beside it on one knee and opened it, and her hands started doing the thing that hands do when they have built the same weapon 10,000 times, and she was reading the water the whole while, her head up, her eyes going out across the sound to the far key and back, and I understood, watching her, that she had been solving the shot in her head since the moment the panic started on the far shore. She had been reading that wind for 9 days from behind the water cans. She was not preparing to try. She was preparing to do it. The problem was Cannon's range, and Cannon's rules, and the collar he had hauled her up by on the second morning. I do not know exactly what made him turn around. Maybe it was that he had run out of shooters and rounds and hope in the same minute. Maybe some part of him had been feeling, all week, the wrongness I had been feeling, the sense of a piece on the board that did not fit the game he thought he was playing. Maybe he simply heard the sound of a bolt behind him, the specific competent sound of a long gun being brought up, and turned toward it the way a man on a sinking range turns toward any sound that might be a rope. He turned and he saw her prone now, on the far long position, the one he had thrown her off of, her own rifle built and up and steady, her cheek already down on the stock, reading the water through her own glass, and I watched the whole war go across his face in about 2 seconds. The outrage first, reflexive, the same thing that had made him grab her collar. And then, right behind it, riding over it, killing it, the cold arithmetic of a man who has 8 failed rounds behind him and a hostage's life in front of him and no time left to be proud. "Master Chief," his spotter said low, "we're not going to make this. The wind's beyond us." Cannon looked at the Texan's gun. He looked at the boxers. He looked at the far key, where a man with a weapon was running out of whatever thin patience had kept 3 people alive so far. And then he looked at the woman he had marched off his line by the collar, lying steady on the position he had told her she did not belong on, and I saw him make the hardest decision I have ever watched a proud man make. He crossed to her. He went down on one knee beside her, the way a spotter kneels beside a shooter, not above her the way he'd stood over her that second morning. And he said, in a voice I could barely hear and will never forget, "Can you make this?" It was not really a question. It was a man setting down 40 years of certainty on the ground, because the certainty had failed, and something in the stillness of the woman beside him told him she would not. Ray's did not take her cheek off the stock. She did not look at him. Her eyes stayed out on the water, on the far key, on the man and the wind and the 2,000 meters of cold moving air between her round and his skull. "Wind's the problem," she said, calm, almost gentle. "It's been the problem all week. Comes off the sea at the flags, doubles back under it, off the water the other way. That's the layer that's eating your rounds. Your shooters are holding for the wind they can see. The shot lives in the wind they can't." A small pause. Her finger was off the trigger, resting straight along the frame, the discipline of it absolute even now. There's a slack coming. The tide's about to turn. When it turns, the two winds cancel for a few seconds, dead air all the way across. Not long, 10 seconds, maybe less. Cannon stared at her. You've been reading this for 9 days. I've been reading water like this for a lot longer than 9 days, Master Chief. And then, because there was nothing else left, because his range and his rules and his pride were all worth less than the life across the water, Master Chief Wade Cannon said the words that turned the whole story over. Then you shoot, he said. I'll spot, tell me what you need. What she needed, it turned out, was almost nothing. That is the part the men talked about afterward, in the low, stunned way people talk about something they don't have a frame for. A shooter at that distance on that day should have needed everything: a dope card, a weather meter, a spotter feeding numbers, 3 ringing rounds to walk it in. She took none of it. She had built the whole solution in her head over 9 silent days behind the water cans, watching every round the course fired die in the draw, filing away exactly how much the long glass wind stole and gave back. She did not need Cannon to call numbers. She needed him to watch the tide. Tell me when the boats stop swinging, she said. The moored ones off the quay. When they hang straight and stop swinging on their lines, that's the slack. That's my window, call it. Cannon got behind his glass. He put it on the moored boats off the far quay, the small working boats swinging on their mooring lines in the wind, and he watched them, and I watched him watch them, and the whole range had gone so silent I could hear the water again, working at the rocks a mile below, the way it had on the first morning before I understood anything. Ray's lay still behind the rifle. Her breathing had gone slow and long and even. Her finger came off the frame and settled onto the trigger, light, waiting. She was not aiming at a target. She was aiming at a place the target would be, in a window of dead air that had not arrived yet, across 2,000 meters of cold sound, at the one man on that whole gray coast who deserved what she was about to send him. Boats are still swinging, Cannon said low. Still swinging, wind still up. A long pause. My watch said 0931. Across the water, the man on the quay yanked a hostage upright and put the weapon under her jaw and screamed something the wind ate, and I felt my own heart stop, and Ray's did not move at all. Come on, Cannon breathed to the tide, to the water, to God. Come on. And then his voice changed. They're slowing, he said. The boats, there, his breath caught. They're hanging straight, slack water. You've got it now. I have replayed the next second more times than I can count. She did not rush it. That is the whole of who she was in 1 second. A man had a gun to a woman's throat 2,000 meters away, and the window was 10 seconds wide and closing, and Ray's did not rush. She let the slack settle. She let the dead air stand up across the whole sound. She took one more slow breath and let out half of it and held, and in the held silence at the bottom of that breath, in the still center of a woman the whole range had decided did not count. She pressed the trigger, straight back the way you are taught, before you are taught anything else. The rifle fired. I did not see the round, of course. No one sees the round. What I saw was the long beat of silence afterward, the impossible stretched second and a half, while a single bullet crossed 2,000 meters of cold air over cold water, through the one narrow window of dead calm in a wind that had beaten 12 trained men for 9 days. And then I saw, across the sound on the far quay, the figure that had been standing over 3 people simply drop, go down. Out of the vertical, all at once, the way only a man who is no longer alive goes down. And the 3 hostages against the stone wall were still standing. For a moment nobody on the range made a sound. 2,000 meters away, the tiny figures that were the hostages stood frozen against the quay wall, not yet understanding they had been saved. And then one of them ran, and then they all did, away from the fallen man, and the far shore erupted into the small, distant chaos of people discovering they are alive. Cannon still had his eye to the glass. His mouth was open. He had called the wind for the finest shooters that range had ever produced and watched them miss 8 times. And then he had watched a woman he'd thrown off his line by the collar make a shot he did not, I think, fully believe was possible even as he watched it land. He took his eye off the glass. He looked at her. Ray's had already lifted her cheek off the stock. She cleared the weapon with the same unhurried economy she did everything, and she safed it, and she laid it down on the mat, and she sat back on her heels, and she looked out across the water at the far quay where the people were running, and her face did the only thing I had seen it do all week that was not perfectly composed. Something loosened around her eyes, not a smile. Just the small letting go of a person who has carried a shot and set it down and had it land true. She did not gloat. She did not turn to Cannon and say anything at all. She had just done the thing every man on that range had failed to do, done it cold, done it first try, done it with a hostage under the gun and no ranging rounds and no dope, and she said nothing about it. She reached over and gently, with 2 fingers, closed the lid of her own rifle case. It was the boxer who said it, from the next position, in a voice with all the wind gone out of it. "Who are you?" And Rays looked at him and looked at the whole silent line and looked last and longest at Master Chief Wade Cannon, and she still did not answer, because she was not going to be the one to say it. That was not in her. Whatever she was, she had let the work be the answer for 9 days, and she was going to let the work be the answer now. The answer came off the radio. It came because Cannon called it in the shot, the result, the shooter. And it came back up the chain faster than anything I had seen move all week, and it came back wrong, or what felt wrong to the men standing there, because the voice on the other end of the radio did not ask who she was. The voice on the other end of the radio already knew. And the way it said her call sign, the way the whole tone of the far end of that radio changed the instant Cannon spoke her name, told every man on the range that they had been standing next to something for 9 days that they had not had the clearance to understand. I got the shape of it later in pieces, some of it from the range and some of it from calls I was, carefully, with much of it redacted, permitted to make afterward. She was not support. She had never been support. She was the most decorated long-range shooter the community had ever quietly fielded, a woman whose actual record was sealed at a level most of the cadre on that range would never see, and whose call sign, the one the radio said back with something close to reverence, was Slackwater. They had named her, years before, for exactly the thing I had just watched, for the discipline of the weight, for the ability to read moving water and cold wind and find the one still window inside the chaos and put a single round through it. She had earned the name doing across other, worse stretches of water what she had just done across Varick Sound, more times than the sealed record would tell me, and she had come to Cape Varick. I never got the full why, and I have stopped needing it, quietly, anonymously, to be near a hard range and read a hard wind, and she had let a tired man haul her off his line by the collar rather than pull the rank and the record that would have ended his career on the spot. That is the part I keep. She could have destroyed him. On the second morning, when he grabbed her collar and told the whole course she was not a shooter, she could have stood up and said one word, her call sign, and Master Chief Wade Cannon's 30 years would have folded like wet paper. She had every right. And she said, "Understood, Master Chief," and went and stood behind the water cans, and read his range better than he did in silence, and waited. And when the day came that his range needed the one thing only she could give, she gave it, and she still did not say the word. She let the radio say it. She let the work say it. I have covered soldiers for 20 years. I have never seen a more complete act of self-command. The salute came at the end of the day, and I almost missed it, and I am glad past saying that I did not. The far shore had settled. The road response had reached the town. The hostages were safe. The man on the quay was what he was, and the range had gone through the long, strange afternoon of a place that has just watched its whole idea of itself get turned over. The men did not know how to be around her now. You could see it. The geometry that had left a space around her like furniture had inverted, and now they arranged themselves toward her, the way men arrange themselves toward something they have decided, all at once and without a word, they will follow anywhere. The boxer had tried to say something and not found it. The farm kid, whose rifle she'd fixed on the first morning, kept looking at her like a man doing sums he should have done days ago. Cannon had said almost nothing all afternoon. He had run the range down, secured the weapons, handled the reports, done all the things a master chief does, and through all of it he had not looked at Ray's, and I understood that it was not because he could not face her but because he was building up to something and did not yet have it built. At the end, when the light was going long and gold across the Sound for the first time all week, and the men were breaking down the line, he crossed the gravel to where she stood by the equipment, where he had put her, where she had stood the whole time she owned that range and let him think he did, and he stopped in front of her. He was not a man who apologized. I don't think the words existed in him. What he had instead was older and, from a man like him, worth more. He came to attention. I want to be exact about this, because it is the thing I flew out to that coast to find without knowing I was looking for it. Master Chief Wade Cannon, 50 years old, 30 of them spent teaching the hardest men alive to shoot. The man who had hauled her off his line by the collar in front of the whole course and told her she was not a shooter, squared his boots on that gravel, drew himself up straight, and brought his right hand up in a slow, deliberate, unhurried salute. Not the quick reflex salute of rank meeting rank. The other kind. The kind a man gives when he is putting the whole weight of himself behind it, because it is the only apology his body knows how to make. He held it. Down the line the men saw. And one by one, the boxer, the Texan, the farm kid, all 12 of them, they stopped what they were doing and turned toward her and came to attention and brought their hands up too, until the whole range that had left a space around her like furniture was standing in salute to her in the long gold light, and the only sound was the wind in the grass and the cold water working at the rocks a mile below, the same water I had heard on the first morning before I understood anything at all. Ray stood very still and let them. She did not wave it off. That would have been its own kind of vanity, and she had none. She understood what it was, that it was owed, that it was theirs to give and hers to receive, that a salute held by a man who threw you off his line is worth more than 1,000 that came easy. She let Cannon hold it as long as he needed to. And then she brought her own hand up, unhurried, and returned it to him, and to the line, and when she lowered it, she said the only thing I heard her say about any of it, quiet, meant for Cannon and carrying just far enough that I caught it. Right call with what you had. Master Chief, a beat, you just didn't have all of it. And that was mercy. She could have left him with the collar. She handed him back his standing instead, told him he'd made a fair read of the range with the information he owned, and that the only thing wrong with the read was that he hadn't known who he was reading. She let him keep the 30 years. It cost her nothing, and it was worth everything. And it was, I think, the truest measure of her, that the deadliest shooter on that whole gray coast spent her last words of the day making sure the man who'd wronged her got to keep his dignity. Cannon lowered his hand. His weathered face worked once and held. "No, ma'am," he said, "I didn't." I flew home 2 days later with a notebook full of things I was not allowed to print and one thing I was, which is the thing I have spent this whole account trying to set down honestly, that I stood on a hard range on a cold coast and looked straight at the best there was and filed her under support, because she was quiet and worn and a woman, and carried another man's rifle case in from the truck. The range taught its lesson to 12 hard men that week. It taught a harder one to me. I had come to write about people learning to read what was in front of them. I left having badly misread the one person on that headland who mattered most, and having watched her forgive, in a held salute and 8 quiet words, every man who did the same. I still can't print her name, but I can tell you the name the radio said back, the one they gave her for the discipline of the weight, for the still window she could always find inside the storm. They called her Slackwater, and on the ninth morning, across 2,000 meters of cold, moving water, in the one breath of dead air the whole day gave up, I watched her earn it.